April 29th, 1945, Berlin, or rather, what remained beneath Berlin, in the concrete belly of the metro, at the Mohrenstrasse station, flooded with the icy, oily water of the Spree. Darkness reigned, broken only by the dim light of a single pocket torch. 5 figures, looking more like ghosts than soldiers of a great army, huddled together on an island of concrete debris. The water was rising. Slowly, relentlessly, centimeter by centimeter. It claimed their last refuge. The cold pierced them to the bone, but it wasn't the worst of it. The worst was the hunger. The kind of hunger that twisted the stomach into a knot of sharp stones, that dried out their mouths and made their minds cling to scraps of memories of the taste of bread. 17-year-old Klaus, their commander, clutched a useless machine gun in his numb hands. His face, covered in dirt and soot, was a mask of concentration. But if you looked closely, you could see an abyss in his eyes. The 4th day in this tomb. For 4 days, they had heard nothing but the rumble of cannon fire from somewhere above, which echoed in the concrete walls as the dull, vibrating groan of a dying city and the monotonous dripping of water, counting down the last minutes of their lives. Beside him sat Helmut, trembling uncontrollably. He had stopped crying. The tears had frozen somewhere inside him. He just stared into the dark water, where their emaciated faces were reflected, and whispered something soundlessly with his cracked lips. Günther, the quietest of them, tried to fix the mechanism of a lighter, hoping to strike a spark. His fingers wouldn't obey, but he stubbornly persisted as if the salvation of the world depended on it. Franz, a country boy who had seen the city for the first time when he came to die for it, hugged the youngest, Eric. Eric was only 16. He lay unconscious, his breathing shallow and intermittent. A fever was burning him from within. They were the last werewolf squad in this sector, children who were handed Faustpatrons and ordered to stand their ground to the death. And they stood, to the last man, until the earth gave way beneath their feet. Now they were trapped, buried alive in the heart of the Reich they had so desperately defended. Klaus raised the torch, and the beam snatched from the darkness a scrap of a red banner with a black symbol in a white circle, floating in the water like a funeral shroud. He still believed that the Führer had not forgotten them. That help would come any moment, that the wonder weapon all the posters screamed about would put the enemy to flight. He had to believe otherwise. All of it was for nothing. Their sacrifices, their hunger, their fear, and the dying Eric in his arms. He didn't yet know that above, in the bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, their Führer had already taken poison, and that the order to flood the subway, cutting off their path of retreat, was one of the last commands from a high command agonizing in its final convulsions. How did these fanatical boys, raised on the idea of self-sacrifice, turn into desperate survivors clinging to life in a concrete hell? To understand how a faith forged from steel and propaganda crumbled into dust, we must go back 5 days, to the day when they still considered themselves heroes, not victims. To the day when the April sun last illuminated their faces, full of the youthful resolve to die for what they so fervently believed in. April 24th, 1945. Berlin was still breathing the smoke of fires, the dust of ruins, and the bitter scent of blooming lilacs, which seemed a mockery in this hell. The morning was deceptively quiet. Fierce battles were already raging on the outskirts, but here, in the Tiergarten district, an illusion of order still remained. Klaus's squad, consisting of 5 teenagers who had just received their Iron Crosses for knocking out a Soviet tank, had taken up position in a half-demolished building overlooking Potsdamer Platz. They were the elite, the Führer's last reserve. At least that's what a gray-haired, weary officer told them as he saw them off to their position. He looked at their young, enthusiastic faces, and his gaze held not pride, but an endless, cosmic weariness. Klaus, as a commander should, was checking their ammunition. Every movement was precise, sharp. He was born to be a soldier. His father had died at Stalingrad, and Klaus had sworn to take revenge. For him, the war was not a tragedy, but a sacred duty. He laid out grenades before him, lovingly wiping each one with a cloth. Helmut, the son of a wealthy industrialist who had been sitting out the war in the rear until the final week, tried to act like a seasoned warrior. He casually smoked a cigarette, flicking the ash onto the shell casing-littered floor, and told the others tall tales of his imaginary exploits. But his hands trembled slightly, betraying the fear he tried so hard to conceal. Günther sat apart, bent over a map of the city. His father was an engineer, one of those who had designed the Berlin subway system. Günther had inherited his father's love for blueprints and diagrams. He studied the map not as a soldier, but as an architect, mentally plotting escape routes, marking ventilation shafts and service tunnels. He didn't say a word, but his mind worked with feverish speed. Franz, who had come from a Bavarian village, stared in amazement at the vast, ruined city. To him, it was all alien, incomprehensible. He thought of his home, the smell of freshly cut grass, the lowing of cows. He took a small wooden figurine from his pocket which he had carved for his younger sister, and squeezed it tightly in his palm. It was his talisman, his anchor to a past, peaceful life. And Eric, the youngest, sat on the windowsill, dangling his legs, and watched the planes flying in the sky with delight. For him, the war was an exciting adventure, a page from a heroic novel come to life. He wasn't afraid of death. He dreamed of it, dreamed of dying a hero, so his name would be written on a memorial plaque at his school. He hummed a jaunty march they had learned at the Hitler youth camp. Their world was simple and clear. There was an enemy to be destroyed. There was a fatherland to be defended, and there was a Führer who was leading them to inevitable victory. They drank hot, bitter ersatz coffee and shared the last loaf of bread among the five of them. They laughed, recalling their pranks at the training camp. They made plans for the future. Klaus dreamed of entering the military academy. Helmut was going to inherit his father's factory. Günther wanted to become an engineer like his father. Franz dreamed of returning to his village and marrying his childhood sweetheart. Eric just wanted to get another Iron Cross. They were children playing at war. A brutal, real war. But for them, it was still a game. They hadn't seen the wounded overflowing the basements, hadn't heard the groans of the dying. They were on the front line, at the tip of the spear, and they felt invincible. Somewhere in the distance, the rumbling started again. The artillery preparation was beginning. Klaus stubbed out his cigarette against a brick wall. "Prepare for battle," he threw to his subordinates. His voice was firm and confident. They took their positions at the windows and breaches in the wall. Erich clutched a Faustpatron, his eyes burning with impatience. He was waiting for enemy tanks to appear so he could perform his feat of heroism. That day, he, like the others, was sure that they would go down in history as the saviors of Berlin. He had no idea that the bang he would hear in a few hours would not be the sound of a shell hitting an enemy tank's armor, but the roar of collapsing floors that would bury them alive in a cold, dark abyss beneath the city. The ground shuddered. A deafening roar merged with the piercing screech of twisting metal and the crack of breaking concrete. For a moment, the world for Klaus and his squad vanished, dissolving in a flash of blinding white light and a suffocating wave of hot air that smelled of gunpowder and burnt dust. A direct hit from an aerial bomb. The building that served as their shelter folded like a house of cards, burying their youthful dreams and fanatical faith beneath it. Klaus awoke in complete darkness. A continuous ringing filled his ears, and a dull, aching pain shot through his entire body. He tried to move, but something heavy pinned him to the floor. Dust clogged his lungs, causing a torturous cough. He was alive. That was his first thought. The second was about his men. "Is anyone alive?" he croaked, but his voice was drowned out by his own coughing. In response, he heard a faint groan, then another. Someone lit a torch. A dim beam tore an apocalyptic scene from the gloom. They had fallen several floors down, right into the lobby of the Potsdamer Platz subway station. Mountains of broken brick, twisted rebar, and furniture debris were piled up around them. The ceiling had collapsed, creating a huge hole through which a gray, smoke-filled sky was visible. But that wasn't the worst of it. From the platform, from the gaping blackness of the tunnels, water was pouring in. First in thin trickles, then in increasingly powerful streams, it filled the station, turning it into a giant pool. They were wounded, shell-shocked, but alive. All 5 of them. Eric lay motionless, and Klaus first thought he was dead, but Franz found a faint pulse. Helmut's arm was broken. He sat leaning against a wall, staring blankly at the bone protruding from his sleeve. Günther, despite a deep gash on his head, was already surveying the scene, trying to assess the situation. His engineer's mind was searching for a way out, even in a state of shock, and the water kept rising. It was already up to their ankles. Icy and filthy, it carried debris, scraps of newspaper, and other things they didn't want to think about. And then they heard a new sound, distant but distinct, a roar of water. Not the water seeping through cracks, but a powerful, unstoppable torrent that was rushing through the tunnels, getting closer with every second. It was the sound of the apocalypse. The sound that meant someone above had decided to turn the Berlin subway into a mass grave. Panic, until now held back by shock, erupted. Helmut screamed, a piercing, childlike scream as if hoping he could stop the advancing wall of water with his cries. Erich groaned and opened his eyes, but there was no awareness in them. He was delirious. Franz tried to bring him around, shaking him by the shoulders, but it was useless. Only Klaus and Günther remained relatively calm. "Up! We have to climb up!" Klaus shouted, pointing to a pile of rubble leading to the hole in the ceiling. But it was too late. The torrent of water that burst from the tunnel swept everything away. It knocked them off their feet, spun them in a furious vortex, mixing them with trash and debris. Klaus lost consciousness for a moment. When he came to, he was being carried by the current through a dark, narrow tunnel. He fought desperately for his life, trying to stay afloat, choking on the icy water. Someone was struggling beside him. He reached out and felt the collar of a tunic. It was Günther. Together they managed to grab onto a cable hanging from the tunnel's ceiling. They held on with their last ounce of strength until the current weakened. Where were the others? They called out, shouted, but the only response was the echo of their own voices and the splashing of water. They thought it was over, that they were the only 2 left in this endless, flooded labyrinth. But then they saw a faint light in the distance. It was a torch. Franz's torch. They were lucky. They had all been washed into the same side service tunnel, which was higher than the main one. They found each other, all 5 of them, wet, frozen, wounded, but alive. They climbed onto a small dry island, a platform by a ventilation shaft. The water here only came up to their waists. They were trapped, separated from the world by tons of concrete, earth, and rising water. Klaus looked at his men, at their terrified, tear-stained faces, and at that moment, he understood. If they were to survive, he had to become more than just their commander. He had to become their jailer and their god. The first few hours in their underground captivity felt like a nightmare. Their bodies ached from bruises and their heads were buzzing. They sat in complete darkness, huddled together for warmth, in silence. Each was lost in his own thoughts, about what had happened, about what awaited them. Helmut was the first to break. His nerves, already stretched to the limit, snapped. He began to sob. Then his sobs turned into hysterical crying. He screamed that they were all going to die, that they had been abandoned, that it was all meaningless. He beat his head against the concrete wall, and his cries echoed through the cavernous tunnels. Klaus silently walked over to him and hit him across the face with all his might. Once. Twice. The hysterics stopped. Helmut went limp and quieted down. Only his shoulders trembled slightly. "We are soldiers, not weeping girls," Klaus said in an icy tone. His voice didn't waver. "Panic is our greatest enemy. Anyone who succumbs to it is a traitor, and traitors get a short shrift. There was so much cold, steely certainty in his words that the others involuntarily flinched. This was no longer the Klaus they knew, their peer and comrade. This was a commander on whose shoulders their lives rested. He lit the only torch. Its beam revealed their pathetic shelter. A small service platform 3 meters by 3. A rusty ladder from a ventilation shaft led upwards, but the grate at the top was hopelessly blocked by debris. A flooded tunnel led down. They were in a concrete sack. The first thing Klaus ordered was an inventory. All they had was his machine gun with 2 magazines, Franz's pistol, 2 knives, the torch, Günther's almost dead lighter, a first aid kit with the last of the bandages and iodine, and Franz's wooden figurine. No food, no water. Well, there was water everywhere, but it was undrinkable. It smelled of slime, fuel oil, and death. They treated their wounds. Eric was in the worst condition. He was unconscious, his body burning with fever. Klaus realized that if they didn't find a way to bring down the fever, Eric wouldn't last until morning. The cold that tormented them could also be their salvation. They took turns soaking rags in the icy water and applying them to Eric's forehead. It was a desperate measure, but they had no other. The hours dragged on like rubber. The hunger grew sharper. They tried to talk to distract themselves, but the conversation wouldn't flow. Any word seemed out of place in this tomb-like silence, broken only by the steady dripping of water and Eric's raspy breathing. Klaus established a watch schedule, 1 man at a time. The others were to try to sleep to conserve energy. Sleep was impossible. The cold was bone-chilling, wet clothes clung to their bodies, and they had nightmares. They dreamed of home, warm beds, their mother's pies. Then they would wake up in this cold, stinking hole, and despair would wash over them in a new wave. Günther, despite Klaus's prohibition, kept flicking his lighter, trying to fix it. This small, almost hopeless ritual helped him keep his sanity. He tinkered with the mechanism with a knife, blew on it, striking a shower of dim sparks again and again. And suddenly, a miracle. A tiny, trembling flame appeared. It lasted only a few seconds, but it was a victory. A small one, but a victory. It gave them a glimmer of hope. They realized they could still fight. But the next problem was far more serious. Thirst. Their mouths were dry, their tongues swollen. They looked at the water surrounding them, and it was sheer torture. And again, the solution came from Günther. He remembered his father telling him about the design of ventilation systems. Condensation, he whispered. There should be condensation on the pipes. Clean water. Klaus pointed the torch beam upwards. And indeed, drops were running down the old, rust-covered pipes that ran under the ceiling. They were infrequent, but they were there. They placed a helmet under them, and the agonizing wait began. Drip, drip, drip. It was the sound of life. Over several hours, they managed to collect a few precious sips of liquid at the bottom of the helmet. It was a pitifully small amount, but it saved them from dehydration. They divided the water equally, leaving the largest share for Eric. But by morning it became clear. The bandages were running out. Eric's fever wasn't breaking, and the hunger was becoming unbearable. It seemed like the end. But it was then that the quiet, ever-silent Günther spoke the words that were both salvation and madness. Commander, I know where a depot might be. A subway maintenance depot. All eyes turned to Günther. A depot? Here? In this flooded hell? It sounded insane. But Günther was completely serious. He explained that his father, the engineer, had often taken him to work. As a boy, he had explored these tunnels far and wide. He remembered that somewhere in this sector, on an old, abandoned line, there was an emergency depot for workers. There should be tools, medical supplies, and maybe even canned food. An emergency reserve in case of a collapse. There was only one problem. To get to it, they had to swim. Swim through dark, flooded tunnels, not knowing what awaited them around the next bend. It was suicide. Helmut immediately protested. He shouted that Günther had gone mad, that he would lead them to certain death. But Klaus silenced him with a single glance. He saw they had no other choice. Sitting here and waiting to die of hunger and disease was even greater madness. He walked up to Günther and looked him straight in the eyes. "Are you sure?" he asked. Günther nodded. "I remember. I'll draw a map." And he began to sketch on the damp concrete with a piece of brick. Lines, passages, forks. He drew from memory, and his diagram was their only hope. The decision was made. 2 would go. The strongest, Klaus and Franz. Günther would stay with Helmut and Erich. He was too weak from his wound. Before leaving, Klaus gave his machine gun to Günther. "If we're not back in 3 hours," he said, "you know what to do." He didn't specify what, but everyone understood. The last bullet for themselves. They made a makeshift torch from a rag soaked in the remaining oil from the torch. It was their only source of light. They tied themselves together with a rope made from a telephone cable so they wouldn't lose each other in the murky water. And they stepped into the darkness. The water was glacial. It burned the body, restricted movement. They waded, waist deep in water, holding the torch above their heads. The silence was oppressive. All they could hear was their own breathing and the splashing of water. Every rustle made them jump. They felt as if someone was in the darkness, that unseen eyes were watching them from the depths. They moved, following the map in Günther's memory. Right after the 3 grates, then straight to the collapse, there should be a passage on the left. It was like wandering through the Minotaur's labyrinth. Their small victory, obtaining water, now seemed insignificant compared to this deadly expedition. But they pushed forward, driven by hunger and hope. And just when they were beginning to despair, when the torch had almost burned out, they saw it. A rusty metal door with the stenciled words, Lagerraum C7, the depot. It was unlocked. The lock had been blown off by the blast wave. They struggled to open the heavy, creaking door and went inside. The smell of damp and mold met them, but to them, it was the most beautiful scent in the world. The depot was small, but it had everything they could have dreamed of. On the shelves were boxes of tools, spools of cable, rubber boots, and most importantly, a first aid kit and a crate of canned food. Several tins of stewed meat and hardtack biscuits. It was treasure. It was life. They couldn't believe their eyes. Franz pried open a tin of stew with a knife and began to eat greedily with his hands, smearing grease across his face. Klaus stopped him. "Easy. We need to make this last." They found a sack and began to load their whole into it. Medical supplies, canned food, a few dry blankets, and the most valuable find, a sealed miner's lamp with a supply of batteries. This was their first real victory. A victory over fear, over despair, over death itself, which was already breathing down their necks. They returned as heroes. When they appeared in the light of the new bright lamp with a sack full of treasures, Günther and Helmut couldn't believe their luck. Helmut cried, but this time they were tears of joy. They built a small fire from old wooden crates. They ate. For the first time in many days, it was the most delicious food of their lives. They bandaged Erich with clean dressings and gave him medicine from the found first aid kit. By morning he was a little better. The fever had broken. They had won. They had conquered suffocation, thirst, hunger, and disease. They felt omnipotent. But they didn't know that their small victory had not gone unnoticed. The smell of smoke from their fire and the warmth of their bodies had attracted the attention of other inhabitants of this underground world. Those who were even hungrier and more desperate than they were. Inspired by their first success, they began to organize their life. Their small island in the midst of a flooded world turned into a fortress, their own personal, tiny empire, built from the wreckage of civilization. Klaus, having firmly established himself as the leader, instituted a strict daily routine. Wake up, morning inspection, food distribution, work, watch duty, lights out. Everything was scheduled to the minute. The discipline drilled into them in the Hitler youth camps now became their main weapon in the fight against chaos. Everyone was assigned a role. Klaus was the strategist and commander. He was responsible for defense and resource allocation. Günther became their chief engineer and cartographer. He continued to explore the nearby tunnels, mapping safe routes, ventilation shafts, and possible shelters on his improvised map. He was their eyes and ears in this labyrinth. Franz, as the strongest and most resilient, became the provider. He made trips to the depot for supplies. Each such trip was a risk, but he obeyed orders without question. Helmut, whom Klaus no longer trusted with responsible tasks, was appointed medic and quartermaster. He monitored Eric's condition and kept a strict account of every can of food, every biscuit. This routine work helped him to stop thinking about the worst and to feel needed. Their greatest achievement was a system for obtaining clean water. Günther, using tools found at the depot, constructed a complex device from a piece of tarpaulin and several pipes to collect condensation. Now they always had a small supply of drinking water. They even learned to filter rainwater seeping through cracks in the ceiling, using charcoal from the fire and several layers of cloth. They improved their dwelling. From old blankets and boards, they built a semblance of a tent that protected them from the pervasive dampness. The fire burned constantly, providing warmth and keeping the darkness at bay. They felt relatively safe. This small system they created gave them not only the physical resources to survive, it gave them something more. A purpose. A goal. They were no longer just victims of circumstance. They were builders. They were masters of their small world. They even created their own rituals. Every evening they would gather around the fire, and Klaus would read them reports from old newspapers they found at the depot. The papers were a month old, but they created the illusion of a connection to the outside world. The illusion that the war was still going according to their rules, and victory was near. They had almost forgotten they were trapped. They had adapted. They were surviving. But the stronger their little empire became, the more clearly the cracks in their unity showed. Helmut, despite his new role, became more and more withdrawn. He would sit for hours, staring at a single point, muttering to himself. His fear had not disappeared. It had merely gone into hiding, like a beast waiting for its moment. Franz, silent and obedient, looked more and more often with longing at his wooden figurine. He followed orders, but the fire was gone from his eyes. He was there in body, but his soul was far away, in his Bavarian village. Even Eric, who had gotten better, had changed. The illness had broken his childish excitement for the war. He became quiet and thoughtful. He no longer sang marches. He just lay and watched the play of shadows on the concrete wall. Only Klaus and Günther were completely absorbed in the process of survival. One in maintaining order, the other in exploration and invention. Their life had fallen into a harsh but predictable rhythm. They had grown accustomed to the darkness, the cold, the constant rumble from above. They began to believe they could hold out until victory, until the moment they would be rescued and hailed as heroes. But not everyone was ready to live by the laws of the new world. In the darkness of their small shelter, in the soul of one of them, a rebellion began to brew. Not a rebellion against Klaus, a rebellion against hope. The tension grew with each passing day. The meager food supplies were dwindling. The monotony and confinement were taking a toll on their psyche. Small quarrels erupted over any pretext: an extra sip of water, a cough that was too loud, a carelessly spoken word. But the real storm broke when Franz returned from another trip to the depot empty-handed. The canned food was gone. Only a few packets of hardtack remained. This news was the last straw for Helmut. His carefully suppressed fear erupted with the force of a hurricane. He leaped to his feet, his face contorted in terror. "That's it. This is the end," he screamed. "We're going to starve to death here. Do you hear me, Klaus? Starve like rats in a cellar." Klaus tried to calm him, but Helmut wouldn't listen. He paced their small patch of ground like a caged animal. "I can't take it anymore. I don't want to die here. We have to do something. We have to get out." "Calm down, Helmut," Klaus said firmly. "Panic won't help us. We'll find another depot. Gunther is already working on it." But Helmut just laughed, a crazed, hysterical laugh. "Another depot? Are you serious? You still believe in those fairy tales? We're in a grave, and you led us into it with your stupid discipline. We should have tried to break through to the surface right away, or surrendered. Yes, surrendered to the Russians. At least they would have fed us." At the word surrender, Klaus's face changed. For him, raised on the code of honor of a German soldier, this was the worst of betrayals. "Shut up," he hissed. But Helmut was unstoppable now. "No, I won't shut up. I want to live. I don't want to die for your Führer who left us here to rot. Do what you want, but I'm leaving. I'm going to scream. I'm going to bang on the walls until someone hears me. Russians, Germans, anyone. I don't care." He lunged towards the flooded tunnel, intending to swim to the main station and raise an alarm. It was an act of desperation, an act of madness. Klaus knew that if he didn't stop Helmut now, he would doom them all. They could be heard not only by rescuers, but also by enemy assault groups, which they knew were combing the subway for remaining pockets of resistance. He threw himself after Helmut. A struggle ensued. They rolled on the concrete floor, trading blows. Helmut, crazed with fear, fought with the fury of a cornered animal. But Klaus was stronger and angrier. He pinned Helmut to the floor and held a knife to his throat. "I said, shut up," he repeated, and his voice carried a deadly threat. Helmut froze. He looked into the cold, merciless eyes of his commander and saw his own death in them. He realized Klaus wasn't joking. He would kill him without a second thought. I understand," Helmut whispered. "I'll be quiet." Klaus removed the knife. He didn't kill anyone. He applied what could later be called surgical cruelty. He didn't just suppress a rebellion. He broke Helmut's will. He showed everyone who was in charge, and that the price of disobedience was death. He dragged Helmut to a far corner and tied him to a pipe. "You'll stay here until you come to your senses," he threw at him. A heavy, oppressive silence fell. Franz, Gunther, and Erich looked at Klaus with a mixture of fear and respect. At that moment, he ceased to be just a comrade to them. He became a chieftain, a tyrant on whose will their lives depended. He had upheld his law. The rebellion was crushed. But while they were dealing with each other, they failed to notice that their real enemy, the water, was preparing its final, devastating blow. The internal enemy was defeated, but the price of this victory was high. The fragile unity of their small group was shattered. Helmut sat tied in the corner, broken and apathetic. He was no longer a threat, but his presence, like a silent reproach, poisoned the atmosphere. The others avoided looking at him and at Klaus. They were afraid. Afraid not only of the outside world, but also of their leader, who had shown them his dark side. Klaus felt it. He felt the wall of alienation that had grown between him and his men. But he did not regret what he had done. He had saved them. That was what mattered. He believed that when they were rescued, they would understand and forgive. But fate had a new, most terrible trial in store for them. For several days, everything was calm. They rationed the last of the hardtack, drank their precious condensation, and remained silent. It seemed as if time had stood still. But one night, they were awakened by a strange hum. It wasn't coming from above, from the city. It came from the depths of the tunnels. The hum grew, turning into a low, vibrating roar. The concrete floor beneath them trembled slightly. Klaus shone his torch towards the flooded passageway, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The water level was rising rapidly. Someone had opened the floodgates again. The water was coming in with terrifying speed. In a few minutes, it would flood their shelter. The panic that Klaus had so brutally suppressed in Helmut now seized him. Flee. They had to flee. But where? The way up through the ventilation shaft was blocked. There was only one way out. To climb the pipes under the ceiling, hoping to find another ventilation shaft or a service level. "Everyone up! Now!" he yelled. They began to scramble up the slippery, rusty pipes. It was madness. Beneath them, an icy torrent churned, ready to swallow them at any moment. Franz climbed first, helping the others up. Günther, despite his weakness, stubbornly climbed upward. Klaus untied Helmut and literally forced him to climb. Lastly, he hoisted up Eric, who was still very weak. They crawled along the pipes in complete darkness, lighting the way with a single torch. Their hands slipped, their strength was failing. The water was already licking at their boots. And at that moment, Eric fell. He cried out and plunged into the churning current. Franz, without a second's hesitation, jumped in after him. He managed to grab Eric by the jacket, but the current was too strong. It was dragging them both into the darkness. Klaus, hanging from a pipe, could only watch helplessly as his men disappeared into the watery abyss. He aimed the torch beam after them, but all he could see was black, churning water. This was the end. He had lost 2 men. He had failed. Something inside him broke. All his faith, all his resolve, all his cruelty had proven meaningless in the face of this merciless element. He, Günther, and Helmut continued on their way. They crawled silently, mechanically, hoping for nothing. They reached a small platform at the base of another ventilation shaft. It was dry here, but they were devastated. They sat huddled together, and they wept. All 3 of them, even Klaus. He wasn't crying from fear, but from helplessness and guilt. He was the commander. He was supposed to save them, all of them. And then, through the noise of the water, they heard something else. Voices, Russian speech. It was an assault team. They were very close, on the other side of the grate that separated their shaft from the main one. They had been discovered. The old Klaus, the one from just a few hours ago, would have given the order to make a last stand. To die, but not to surrender. But that Klaus no longer existed. He looked at the terrified faces of Günther and Helmut, and he made a different decision. He had to save them, at any cost. He remembered his last discovery, something he had found during one of his excursions and had told no one about. A small box of signal flares, and a daring, insane plan formed in his mind. And it was at that very moment, in the ensuing silence, that Günther, who had been feverishly tinkering with an old distribution panel on the wall, let out a cry. But it was not a cry of terror. It was a cry of amazement. "A radio! There's a field radio line here." Günther's discovery was a miracle. An old, dust-covered field telephone, connected to a miraculously intact communication line that led somewhere upstairs, to the sector defense headquarters, or what was left of it. Günther, with trembling hands, connected the device. They didn't know if the line worked. They didn't know if anyone would hear them, but it was a chance. Klaus took the receiver. He cranked the inductor handle for a long time, sending call signals into the dead wire. And suddenly there was a crackle in the receiver, followed by a quiet, tired voice. "Who is on the line?" Klaus couldn't believe his ears. Communication? They had communication. He reported who they were, where they were, what had happened to them. He asked for help. But the response on the other end of the line was like a thunderclap. The voice in the receiver, belonging to some major, gave them the latest news. The fighting in Berlin had practically ceased. The garrison command was negotiating a surrender. And the most terrible news of all. On April 29th, the Führer, Adolf Hitler, had committed suicide in his bunker. For Klaus, this was more than just news. It was the end of the world. His entire world, all his faith, everything he had lived for, fought for, and was ready to die for, collapsed in an instant. The Führer was dead. The Reich had fallen. Their sacrifice was in vain. Their feat was meaningless. He silently hung up the phone. Günther and Helmut looked at his petrified face and understood everything without a word. Their world had turned to dust. And at that moment, they again heard the voices of the Russian soldiers behind the grate. They were clearly trying to break the lock. In a few more minutes, they would be here. Klaus faced a choice. die here in a final, pointless battle, as his oath, which he no longer believed in, demanded, or try to save what was left of his squad, save 2 terrified, broken boys who had entrusted their lives to him. He looked at Gunther, at Helmut, and he chose life. "Follow me," he said curtly. He led them down a narrow service corridor that only he knew about. He was leading them to his secret weapon, to the box of signal flares. His plan was simple and brilliant in its madness. He was going to create a diversion, cause noise, an explosion, a commotion in one place to distract the Russians, while they escaped in another direction under the cover of smoke. Gunther, with his knowledge of the tunnels, would have to find them a path to the surface. They reached a small platform that hung directly over the flooded station where the wave had almost caught them. The Russians were already there, combing the platform. Klaus took out the flare gun. He fired. A red flare shot up and hit the ceiling, showering everything below with a cascade of sparks. Then a second one. A third. He fired the entire supply. Panic erupted below. The Russians, thinking they were in an ambush, opened fire indiscriminately and began to retreat. Under the cover of this chaos, Klaus, Gunther, and Helmut began their last desperate dash for freedom. They ran through dark, half-flooded tunnels, guided by the genius of Gunther, who seemed to see in the dark. They twisted and turned, changing direction, deceiving their pursuers. It was no longer a battle. It was a hunt, and they were the prey. The euphoria of escape was replaced by a primal fear. They were no longer soldiers. They were just children, desperately wanting to live. They were running from the war, from their past, from themselves. They didn't know what awaited them on the surface. They didn't know that their salvation would turn into a new prison. A prison of mistrust, oblivion, and the cynicism of a victorious world that had no need for heroes of a lost war. Their ordeal in the underground hell, their small victory over death, was needed only by them. But the system that had created and betrayed them was preparing its own verdict, and it was far more terrible than death in battle. They emerged onto the surface through a sewer manhole somewhere in the Tiergarten area. The first thing they saw was the sky. Gray, smoky, but so vast and alive after the endless darkness of the underground. They greedily gulped the air, which smelled of soot and death. But to them, it was the air of freedom. And then they looked around. Ruins were everywhere. The skeletons of burned-out buildings, mountains of broken bricks, twisted tramcars, and silence. Not the oppressive silence of the underground, but the dead silence of a destroyed, surrendered city. The war was over. Soviet soldiers walked the streets. They were laughing, smoking, playing accordions. They were the victors. And Klaus, Gunther, and Helmut were the vanquished. 3 ragged, dirty boys in the uniform of the enemy army. No one was waiting for them. No one needed them. Their heroism was forgotten before it even had a chance to become history. A patrol met them. Tired, middle-aged soldiers. They showed no aggression. They simply took Klaus's machine gun and led them to the commandant's office. There, their first interrogation awaited them. A young NKVD lieutenant with cold, piercing eyes listened to their story with open disbelief. The flooded subway, the survival, the breakout. It all sounded like a fantastic fairy tale. He concluded they were saboteurs from the werewolf trying to cover their tracks. They were separated and sent to a prisoner of war camp. There they faced a new hell. A hell of humiliation, hunger, and contempt. To the Soviet soldiers, they were fascists. To the other German prisoners, adult, hardened warriors, they were snot-nosed kids from the Hitler Youth, the Führer's last levy, who had brought Germany to disaster. They were strangers among their own and enemies among foreigners. Their story would have remained untold if not for a single incident. The very same Major Klaus had spoken to on the phone ended up in the same camp. He recognized Klaus by his voice. He confirmed their story. A reenactment was conducted. Gunther was forced to go down into the subway again and show them their escape route. He flawlessly led the investigators through the entire labyrinth. Their story was proven. But instead of rewards, they were met with an order of non-disclosure. Their story was too inconvenient. It didn't fit into the Soviet propaganda of an easy and swift victory, nor into the German legend of the heroic defense of Berlin. Their brotherhood, forged in the underground hell, was destroyed. They were separated and sent to different camps. Their fate was buried in secret archives. Klaus was tried as a war criminal. He received 10 years in the camps. He built cities in Siberia, silently laying brick after brick. He never returned to Germany. Günther, after several years in a camp, was released. He returned to a ruined Berlin and became a civil engineer. He rebuilt his native city, and it is said that for the rest of his life, he had a panic fear of going down into the subway. Helmut couldn't take it. His mind, cracked in the underground, finally broke in the camp. He died in a hospital for the mentally ill, never regaining consciousness. Nothing is known about the fate of Franz and Erich. They remained forever in the flooded tunnels of Berlin, becoming part of its dark legend. He was buried in an unmarked cemetery for prisoners in a distant, cold land. But, as the old camp inmates told, on his grave, lost among thousands of others, someone would leave a sprig of blooming lilac every spring. Who brought it and why, no one knew. Official history forgot their names. There was not a single line in the military reports about a squad of 5 boys trapped in a flooded subway. Their feat of survival, their small, desperate war against death was erased, wiped out, declared non-existent. To the victors, they were just a statistic among the prisoners. To the vanquished, they were an unpleasant reminder of the shame and agony of the Third Reich, which in its final days threw its own children into the furnace of war. They did not become heroes. There were no parades or memorial plaques waiting for them. They simply disappeared, dissolved in the chaos of the post-war world. Klaus, the indomitable leader who ended his days in a foreign land. Günther, the brilliant engineer who feared his own creations for the rest of his life. Helmut, the broken voice of despair, silenced forever within the walls of an asylum. And Franz and Erich, the keeper of wisdom and the innocent victim, forever buried in the concrete sarcophagus beneath the streets of Berlin. Their story became a scar, an invisible scar on the body of the city and in the souls of the few who survived. But what official chronicles erase, the memory of the people preserves forever. Their story did not die. It went underground. It became a legend, a soldier's tall tale. It was said that among the old workers of the Berlin subway there was a belief about the ghost children of the Mohrenstrasse station. They said that in the deepest and most abandoned tunnels, where the lights don't work and even the bravest urban explorers fear to tread, you can sometimes hear quiet voices, laughter, crying, fragments of commands in German. They said it was the souls of those same Hitler youth boys who never found their way to the surface, who remained there forever in their small, flooded empire, continuing to stand their eternal watch. This story is not just a chronicle of survival. It is a parable about a lost generation, about children whose childhood was stolen, who were handed deadly weapons instead of toys, about how faith, taken to the point of fanaticism, can become the most terrible curse, and about how even in the darkest hell when empires fall and gods die, something remains in a person that makes him fight. Not for a Führer, not for a flag, not for an idea, but simply for the right to take another breath, for the right to live.